My name is Paddy Carter. I am the Head of Development Economics here at BII. BII is the UK's development finance institution. We invest about $2 billion annually, both debt and equity, both directly into businesses and indirectly via partners such as fund managers and banks. And we invest predominantly in Africa and South Asia. Our mission can be described in various different ways, but our strategic impact objectives are to help make the economies of the countries that we invest in more productive, more sustainable, and more inclusive. Now, a good investment might do a bit of all of those three, but today our focus is on the sustainability aspect, and we are here to learn about the adoption of green technologies that are going to transform the nature of production so that it is resilient and environmentally sustainable. So we are great consumers of research here at BII. We want our strategy which directs our origination efforts, what sorts of investments we prioritize, and how we use our influence in those investments to be evidence-based. Some of that evidence comes from an evaluation program managed in-house and with our shareholder, the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which has the job of investigating the impact of our investments. But it is only possible to learn so much from studying individual investments. To learn more about what we do, we are very reliant on the broader evidence base from development economics historians, and other researchers. This conference is co-sponsored by one such research program that generates evidence that we use, PEDAL, which stands for the Private Enterprise Development in Low-Income Countries program, which funds research into the impact of private businesses. It itself is part of a larger FCDO-funded research program, which includes STEG, Structural Change and Economic Growth, which looks at more macro questions, and new Recipe, which looks at the relationship between economics and conflict. If you're not already familiar with these, they've got great websites, look them up, they do great work. But it is only possible to learn so much from academic research. That's for two reasons. Firstly, academic research methods can't answer every question, meaning that we cannot always get the data, or we cannot always sort correlation from causation. And secondly, some of what businesses are doing is either too niche or too new for anybody to have studied it yet. So we must learn about the impact of businesses by listening to the people who run them and their workers and their customers, and how they think the market works and what they think their businesses are achieving. Now, of course, as investors, we also need to listen to businesses because we need to understand the commercial angle. BII and other impact investors, we want to create impact by helping to grow sustainable private enterprises, so we need to understand what can be done profitably. Now, all this is a long-winded explanation for why we are putting business executives and academics on the same stage today. We organize these conferences really because in the end we want to influence ourselves and other impact investors. And we think that if you are an impact-oriented investor, you need to listen to information from both of these two sources. We also organize these conferences because we think that researchers and business leaders ought to speak to each other more often. And I'm sorry that this doesn't apply to those of you who are watching online, but for those of you in the building today, we've scheduled several breaks, and we hope that you are going to use them to talk to one another and discover opportunities for collaboration. And that's not all we are going to ask of you today. We want today's event to be less a series of presentations and more of a dialogue. So we've asked our speakers to keep their opening remarks short, and we're going to rely on you, the audience, for your questions to get the most out of our speakers. And that does apply to those of you who are watching online. You can submit questions using the Q&A function. So that's nearly enough from me, but I just have one last thing to say. As BII, we really benefit from having a shareholder who cares about evidence and is prepared to pay for it. This sounds a little bit over the top, but I think it's fair to say that the global development community has benefited from the UK government having long recognised the importance of knowledge creation and dissemination. And I think a lot of what the world knows about the results of development policy and interventions can be traced back to FCDO funding. I'm well aware that under point 3 of GE&I, there's not a lot of room for manoeuvre, but even if in somewhat diminished form, I hope that continues. And that's my segue into introducing Dennis Novy, who was appointed to the role of Chief Economist and Director of Analysis at the FCDO in October this year. Dennis doesn't hold the purse strings of research funding, but his role and that of his team is to ensure that UK development strategy is grounded in evidence and sound economic analysis. Dennis, over to you.
Thanks, Paddy. Okay, well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Paddy, for the introduction. As I said, as Paddy was saying, I'm Dennis Novy. I'm the Chief Economist for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And it's my pleasure to be here this morning and open this event. I would first like to begin by expressing my thanks to British International Investment and also the PEDAL initiative, Private Enterprise Development in Low-Income Countries, for their efforts in organizing today's gathering. FCDO set up BII in 1948 under the Overseas Resources Development Act, and back then it was called the Colonial Development Corporation, CDC, and it had a very simple mission from the start, which is to do good without losing money. PEDAL is a joint research initiative of CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research, and the FCDO that we launched in 2011. And it's part of FCDO's wider growth research platform and has awarded over 350 research grants for projects related to the behavior of firms in low-income countries. And CEPR is a wider partner for us. PEDAL is one initiative. We also work with CEPR on others, for example, the STEG, Structural Transformation Initiative. So this is a very important partner to us. I'm excited to see today and welcome a mix of researchers, private sector leaders, and investors here in the room, and welcome all of you who have joined today and who might join us online. I'm optimistic that by bringing together such a diverse range of expertise, we can have a meaningful discussion about the challenges and opportunities of climate technology adoption predominantly in Asia and Africa. Collaboration between researchers and practitioners can accelerate the development of practical solutions and drive real impact. I'm going to say a few things about climate adaptation and finance needs by way of background. In 2023, Sub-Saharan Africa received about $47 billion in climate finance, and that just represented 2% of global flows, and it is falling well short of the estimated $140 to $300 billion that are estimated to be needed annually by 2030. And that's for climate adaptation alone. And of all this amount, only 30% was sourced from private finance. Now, these numbers vary by source, and as we all know, they can be very difficult to come up with, so we shouldn't get fixated on them. But the key point is that necessary and desirable investments in climate technology are not happening at the scale needed, neither in Africa nor in Asia. And therefore, we should collectively be looking for ways to find the most catalytic and efficient ways of financing those investments. And that is a big part of today's event. New climate technologies designed for the unique challenges in Africa and Asia are needed and increasingly available, but not always scaling at the pace needed. As an example, the University of Chicago has done research finding that climate-resilient crops could mitigate billions of lost agricultural production and could generate about $24 of economic benefit for every $1 spent catalyzing private sector flows. Research, innovation, and interventions tilting the playing field in favor of clean solutions will be key, because enabling climate innovation requires both push and pull. And where, for example, fossil fuel subsidies remain in place, or where there's no price signal from the market whatsoever on climate or social benefits, then investment and uptake might be slow and too slow. Now, the UK has a strong history of working with the private sector to scale up technology and innovation, and public finance will never be able to provide all the necessary investments at sufficient pace. Paddy mentioned that, as everybody knows in this room, the finances are tightening there, not just in the UK, but globally. That's probably a fair statement to make. As the UK's development finance institution, BII is at the forefront of our financing offer to emerging economies, driving innovation and impact where greater finance is crucially needed. In 2024 alone, they committed £708 million in climate finance. The UK also supports upstream innovation, building the pipeline of investments through strong partnerships, and there's flagship initiatives like our ITIN fund that have supported innovations that have improved clean energy for more than 37 million people and leveraged more than 1.5 billion pounds from the private sector, with BII increasingly participating in the scale-up of these innovations. So to conclude, in this new development world, with ever more emphasis being placed on the importance of private investment mobilization, there's increasing pressure on DFIs to more clearly demonstrate impact. And this is why research is so important, and this is why this link to PEDAL is so important. Our ministers do ask about this. They do want to see impact. So we need to link up all these various initiatives through BII and the fantastic private sector involvement with top-level research. This is ever more crucial to justify the funding. There's evidence that DFI investment generates jobs at the national and at the portfolio level, but we don't have a deep enough understanding yet of spillovers and impacts beyond the firm. And this is, again, where research is really crucial to make that case that there are spillovers beyond the firm and where they happen and how and what works and what does not work. PEDAL formed a dedicated research theme, partnering with BII to try and fill precisely that evidence gap. And research can help DFIs to better understand the channels through which investments affect livelihoods. But doing so requires everyone in this room today, so that's researchers, investors, and private sector leaders, to communicate and work together to develop the knowledge agenda. And workshops such as this one today are an ideal opportunity to help bring research into practice and get researchers closer to the issues that matter most for private investors and public impact. And I hope that in that spirit, this is going to be a successful day. And I hope you will all talk to each other and come up with new ideas and play around with new initiatives. And thank you so much again to BII for organizing this event, everybody for coming and hosting us. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello. So welcome to our first panel, which is on agriculture, one of the most important, perhaps the most difficult, but also in places one of the most exciting sectors for green technology adoption. This conversation could be about carbon emission reduction, or it could be about adaptation and resilience. I think the boundaries between adaptation and resilience in agriculture and general agricultural development are a little bit blurry, and I don't think we need to worry too much about the distinction today. So the format of this session and all the sessions, we're going to ask each of our panelists to give short opening remarks. I'll come back with a couple of follow-up questions before we turn to you for Q&A. Some of the speakers are going to use slides, others aren't. And I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves as we go along, rather than try and do that all myself. So Jessica, I'm asking you to kick things off for us, please.
Great. Thanks so much, and thank you for the invitation to come present to this audience. We've already had a lot of really exciting conversations with people where we're aligning what we know from academia with practitioners, so it's been really valuable already. So I'm Jess Rutter. I'm an assistant professor at Oregon State University, which is on the west coast of the United States. My research largely considers the kind of market and information environment that smallholder farmers are in when they're making decisions about how to optimize production. And so across places that I work, we see really wide variation in how much farmers are accessing input markets. So in some places like Tanzania, market penetration rates of new seeds, for example, is actually still quite low, whereas their neighbor in Kenya, there's a lot more action, there's a lot more adoption happening there. And likewise, a place like Guatemala, where I've been working on a large-scale RCT, there is high adoption across the board, but then the regional variation is really high. And so whether you're working in an environment where the question is on the extensive margin, getting farmers into the market in the first place, versus more of an intensive margin question, that's going to frame a lot of what we do as well. So sorry, I want to make sure I'm getting my notes. You know, in academia, we need our slides, but I opted not to have that, but I still need my little guidance. So one thing that's a takeaway from this academic literature is that we do see that even smallholder farmers that are operating at small scales are benefiting from adopting new improved seeds, whether that's fully hybrid seeds or whether that's selected on other margins that are climate resilient, but that often requires subsidies. So particularly if you want to target vulnerable farmers, those vulnerable farmers are more likely to experiment with seeds if they have some subsidy to experiment in the first place. But what we actually don't know a lot about from the research is the durability of adoption. So we may be good at incentivizing a smallholder farmer into adopting something for a trial run, and then we may measure 1 or 2 seasons after that, but we know very little about how it deteriorates over time or whether farmers are holding on to those seeds and are then purchasing them at market rates. And so we have sort of mixed evidence on what happens there. And so, of course, what's critical in that setting is the type of farmer that you're targeting. And so if your objective is to target really small-scale farmers who need those subsidies in order to be able to do an experiment on farm in first place, then you may have a different strategy versus if you're targeting like relatively medium or large-scale farmers with the idea that you're promoting generalized growth in the area, right? So one place that I work in is Guatemala, where the NGO that I collaborate with has developed biofortified seeds. And so one feature of biofortification is that it is a little bit of a general purpose technology. It's designed to target farmers across a range of climate and, one thing that's important there is elevation circumstances so that farmers can opt in. But the private kind of value of biofortification is a little bit lower than what the public value is. So, we biofortified seeds because you want families and particularly small children to have access to the nutrition benefits that come with those seeds. But the person who's the decision maker when they're buying seeds, it's not necessarily something that they're incorporating into their value function, so to speak. And so with something like that, it's general purpose in the sense that it can target anyone in Guatemala, but at the same time, you want it to target these most vulnerable families, right? So you may have regimes of subsidies that differ from a context elsewhere. So with a lot of climate resilient seeds, though, often the type of adoption that you're looking at is something that's a little more tailored to a particular microclimate. So the best example of this is flood-tolerant seeds in Bangladesh or India, where flood tolerance is really determined at the very micro level, how close you are to a kind of flood-prone plain, and then what your elevation is on that plain. And so you wouldn't want to see widespread adoption of these seeds because it's not necessarily the case that it has a much higher return in every year. It really just depends on whether you're in a vulnerable location. And so the types of the way you might approach something would differ there too. And so one thing I wanted to highlight since we're here between practitioners and kind of evaluators or academics is that when we're running evaluations, we want to subsidize farmers to adopt. And in order to detect effects on things that we care about, we need adoption rates to be quite high. And so in Guatemala, we had like a range of subsidies that we were offering people, and we could identify an optimal subsidy based on how you were targeting. But that was having a target rate of around 30 to 50% adoption, because that's what we needed in order to be able to detect effects on outcomes that we care about. But it turns out the NGO that we were working with was looking for a market penetration rate of around 5 to 10%. And so there was this really big gap between sort of what we needed in order to evaluate it. And then we came up with, we might have that right, so to speak, answer around what the kind of proper subsidy level is. But then the NGO has absolutely no expectation that 50% of people are adopting this across the board in Guatemala, right? And so I think that's like an interesting tension that we can think about together that I would love to talk to people about.
Thanks very much, Jess. And Joshua, you're next up.
Sure. All right. Thank you very much for being here and for inviting me. My name is Josh Deutschman. I'm an economist with the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago. I also have been supporting the work of the Innovation Commission for Climate Change, Food Security, and Agriculture, which is a 3-year high-level commission aiming to identify innovations in the agriculture and food space, particularly focused on adaptation and mitigation, with rigorous evidence of impact, not only for the innovation itself, but as appropriate for methods to get farmers to adopt the innovation, evidence of cost effectiveness, and in our judgment, a plausible pathway to scale. So we've reviewed the literature and released a longer list of innovations that we think fit these characteristics, and have then taken an active role in starting to implement some of these. And so some of these innovations have a bit more of a public sector focus, like scaling access to weather forecasts for farmers, which we've done in collaboration with a large group, including Precision Development. But some of these have a really strong private sector component. And so I'll focus today on financial innovations, and one financial innovation in particular, which is in part come out of the work of the Innovation Commission and has also been a sort of a research focus for our lab at Chicago. So many small farmers in East Africa are members of essentially, they're called savings and credit cooperatives. So these are smaller scale financial institutions, function on a cooperative structure so that members have shares in the cooperative and they lend out their savings to each other. You can think of this as a formalization and growth of some smaller scale rotating credit type arrangements. This is a pretty robust sector. There are hundreds or thousands of these in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. They're providing a pretty sophisticated suite of financial products and a lot of them are primarily serving farmers. So in many ways, these are solving a lot of financial inclusion issues for a pretty underserved population, but we think there's potential to do a lot more. And so we're building on some research that worked with a particular SACCO to test relaxing borrowing constraints for investing in water tanks. So this is a SACCO in Kenya serving dairy farmers. Dairy farmers have really regular income that gets paid monthly by a dairy cooperative into their SACCO savings account. So, and then typically when a member wants to invest in an asset like a water tank, they need to get guarantors who have shares in the cooperative to commit their shares. And so this is effectively a 100% cash collateralized loan, which is very low risk for the SACCO, but constrains a lot of people from borrowing. So in a randomized trial, they found that by relaxing the borrowing constraint and moving to an asset collateralized model, say a 75% asset collateralized model, where farmers just had to put down a security deposit of 25%, they could increase demand for this loan and asset adoption by tenfold with no change in lending risk. So there were no defaults in this study when they moved to a 75% asset collateralized loan. They replicated these results in a second round of a randomized trial. And then starting in 2015, the SACCO that was the partner in this research fully took over the program and scaled it up. So they've grown to have more than 25,000 members. They've made thousands of these asset loans since 2015. The portfolio has continued to perform well. So our question was then, what do we do to get this to a lot of these other hundreds and thousands of financial institutions that are serving farmers? So one question one might ask is just, is this a particularly good institution? Maybe they just really do a great job of managing their relationships with their borrowers. They do a great job on recovery. So we embarked on something of a replication study in partnership with Precision Development with two other SACCOs in a different region in Kenya. And so again, we went out and we randomly selected some farmers to have access to this loan. We wanted to understand what the demand was for this loan in a new setting and what the performance of the loan contracts would be. And broadly, we find very similar results. We find that when you just go out to a sample of farmers, we find about 20% are interested in taking up this loan within a reasonable period of time. And the loan performance is very good. I think there's been one repossession in total out of all the loans made in that project. So very, very reasonable rates of risk in that loan portfolio. So that answers one question. This can work in other places. Farmers demand it. We replicate some of the welfare benefits for farmers. So what we see across these two settings is that farmers who are able to get water storage, they produce more milk, they sell more milk to the dairy cooperative. In particular, they're more resilient, so they're better able to take advantage of rainfall and smooth fluctuations in rainfall over time. Somewhat perhaps obvious because they have water storage, but we do actually see this borne out in the data. We also see that there are welfare benefits for households. Women in households in particular spend less time fetching water. Girls in these households spend more time in school. And we were actually able to go back to some of the participants from the original study more than 10 years later and see that some of these benefits continue to hold even then. So in an entirely different cohort of children, there's still increases in girls' school attendance in households that got that got access to water tanks 10 years ago. So we're pretty excited about the potential for scaling this by working through this sort of private sector model, working with local financial institutions like savings and credit cooperatives or credit unions or really any type of institution that is working with farmers, in particular in these contexts where there's sort of potential for value chain finance. So the fact that income is paid in directly really reduces the kind of the costs of managing this loan portfolio. Most loan payments are deducted automatically. There's less prospects for things like side selling and having to chase down a whole bunch of farmers to make payments. So now we're working on continuing to scale this up, identifying other constraints that prevent to better understand what exactly is needed at an institutional level, at a financial institution level, to adopt a new financial innovation like this. So, we're of course very interested in this particular innovation, but it's also an interesting question more generally, how do institutions adopt innovations and learn from each other? On the one hand, these are typically in the Kenyan setting cooperatives, so there is some spirit of sharing and ownership and willingness to trade ideas. On the other hand, there's some competition, and so maybe a SACCO is happy to help another SACCO that's far away, but maybe not their neighboring SACCO. And so how do we learn more about the kind of the process of diffusion of innovations across institutions, and how does it change as new players enter the market and try to further improve on the model? We're testing some different modifications of the loan contract as well to better learn. Can we further optimize this contract? Can we bring even lower income borrowers in a way that is still within risk tolerances for the SACCO? So I'm happy to get more into all the details of what we're doing, but I think that gives an overview.
And it seems like such a obviously good idea to move to asset-based lending, and there are still hundreds of SACCOs that aren't following it. Maybe we can come back on that.
Absolutely.
What might change that situation. Tomoko, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. My name is Tomoko Harigaya, and I'm the Chief Economist at Precision Development. It's a global nonprofit working with governments, private sector, and other partners to scale evidence-based innovations to tens of millions of smallholder farmers. And digital agricultural advisory has been a big part of our work. And our approach has always been to incorporate insights from economics and behavioral sciences and kind of serve as a bridge between science, service providers, and farmers. So in the next few minutes, I'll try to summarize the growing evidence base on digital agriculture. So the first insight is that I think there's a very robust evidence now that localized and real-time information services can help farmers adapt to climate and weather risks. And that includes both targeted approaches like sending just a few text messages and promoting specific agricultural inputs, and the comprehensive advisory services that provide a wider range of advice over the course of the season. So one example from our work is that we've worked with the government of Orissa in co-designing and scaling a comprehensive customized digital advisory service that uses local, real-time information on weather, pests, and things like that. The service is now reaching 8 million farmers in the state, and the impact evaluation has shown that the service was particularly effective in areas hit by weather shocks, like excessive rainfall in one year, insufficient or scarce rainfall in another year. And the impact can be as large as a 20% reduction in the likelihood of severe crop loss. So it's pretty substantial. Another really promising area, as Josh mentioned, is weather forecasts. There are, at this point, multiple randomized evaluations showing that farmers really meaningfully respond to these weather information, weather forecasts. And Jess actually has one study in Pakistan showing that even 1 to 2 day forecast on temperature can help farmers avoid going out to the field on extremely hot days. And I think what makes these services really compelling is the cost. So once these services reach scale, the marginal cost of running these services is extremely low. So in the case of Orissa, the service now is running probably at 35 cents per farmer per year. So when you think about the long-term benefit cost ratios, it could be very, very high. So that's one area. And then second, I think going beyond direct information services to farmers, I think there are many ways you can use digital technology, digital tools to address market frictions. And here I'll just give a couple of examples. First, digital marketplaces, right, to connect buyers and sellers in agricultural output markets. I think this is a relatively new area, but there's some early evidence, really promising evidence, that shows that these kinds of marketplaces can significantly reduce transaction costs and actually increase the overall trading volume and flows. And then second example, I think this is a kind of interesting emerging area, is crowdsourcing platforms. One of the big barriers for farmers to adapt to climate adaptation or more generally agricultural technologies is very high levels of uncertainties about the quality of inputs, right? There's a huge variation in the quality of seeds and fertilizers and so on. And recent research shows that these kinds of crowdsourced information clearing houses can be really one potential way to address this kind of challenge. A quick example here as well would be a Yelp-like rating system of agricultural services and quality of products or prices. And there's a study actually in Pakistan showing that these kinds of rating system can significantly improve the performance of agricultural service providers without increasing prices for farmers, and just by creating incentives for service providers to offer better products and services. So, and then I think there are a couple other studies that actually show similar line of results in different geographies. So I think this is a really exciting area. There's a lot more that can be done. And generally, I think this is second area of using digital technologies to address market frictions is again relatively new. So there's some early insights that look promising, but we don't really know yet about what kinds of systems could actually successfully scale, what the impact on farmers will look like over time, how that affects market dynamics and so forth. So I think that there are lots of learning and experimentation opportunities there. So just to wrap up, robust evidence, a lot of scaling opportunities already exist for the localized agricultural advisory and weather information. Lots of, again, promising insights, but a lot more work to be done in this kind of the market side digital interventions.
Thank you very much. So we've just had three perspectives from research, and now we're going to listen to the voices of three practitioners. You may be wondering where the third person is. They are lurking online, I hope. Okay, great. Shailendra, over to you, and you need a clicker, I think, for some slides. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Very good morning. My name is Shailendra Tiwari. I'm founder and CEO of an Indian company called Fasal. We're an ag tech venture, some 7-8 years old. Now, for the last 7 years, me and my team have been working with day-to-day realities of horticulture farms across India and Southeast Asia. We help horticulture farmers make better decisions, and at times very precise decisions, basis where in the curve of adaptation they are. We help them make judgments, sound judgments about irrigation management, so when they need to water, how much. We help them make judgments about nutrition management, climate risk management, disease management, and pest management. We currently work with smallholders who roughly together own about 150,000 acres of farmland across these belts in India, the ones that are marked, and Southeast Asia. These are farmers who are growing variety of fruits, vegetables, plantation crops, or spices. Now, if you work long enough with farmers, you realize that climate change to them doesn't arrive in headlines or in bars or charts and graphs. It arrives to them in forms of uncertainty. So earlier it used to rain on day X, now it doesn't. It rains 30 days later, it rains 30 days earlier. They don't know. Suddenly there is a window of humidity that creates pockets for disease risk they didn't expect. Or the bore well through which they have been irrigating their land suddenly doesn't have enough water. This is where we come into picture. We help reduce these uncertainties. Our technology is a combination of, as you can see, a component of hardware, software, other components of data collection, including satellite images or manual data, essentially whatever impacts the farm. And then our core expertise is crop sciences, where we understand the dance of these data sets together and how they impact these kind of decisions and ultimately build in more certainty on the farm. Now, farmers are pragmatic. Our technology has scaled because it makes money for them. It helps them reduce a spray. It improves their yield. It allows them to irrigate 20 acres of land with the same amount of water that they had earlier, which they thought was enough only for 5 acres. In general, our experience has been that whatever delivers ROI to farmers in a season gets adapted. They are curious about things. They are unfortunately the beneficiary of climate change in ways that are difficult to fathom. They have to suffer through it or endure through it on day-to-day basis. So they are already trying to adapt. And in general, my own realization is that as a species, we still don't see climate change as something that affects all of us in ways that every action is evaluated in the sense that if we do this, this is going to harm the civilization. On the farmer side, the way it reflects is whatever helps them tackle through these kind of uncertainties on a seasonal basis or maybe a couple of seasons, and they can see the ROI, they are willing to adapt, they are willing to pay. Now, we didn't build Fasal as a climate company for this very same reason. Farmers don't change their practices or adapt technologies because in general it is good for the climate. I don't think that individual responsibility of climate change is yet on farmers. They look at it as something that can be proven on day-to-day basis, removes their day-to-day uncertainties. And I've seen a lot of farmers adapt to technologies that that didn't make sense 7 years ago. People questioned whether people will pay for it, farmers will pay for it and whatnot. Even when we started this company in 2018, I recall it very well, talking to a lot of investors from morning to evening, telling them that we could sell IoT devices to farmers. It sounded an oxymoron. But the truth is, whatever delivers ROI in a season, whatever removes that uncertainty, is something that they are willing to adapt. Now, Paddy, one of the questions that you had was, what is the resistance in adaptation? I think in general, my sense is, it's not the willingness of the farmers. If something that is an ROI, I think farmers are willing to adapt to it. The challenge is with the cost of onboarding. So sometimes you might have technologies which are expensive now, but could be scaled and brought in within the frameworks of proven ROI. Farmers need subsidies for that. I also think generally, at least in the world that I operate in, or the parts of the world that I understand, overuse is more incentivized than efficiency. So for example, water is free. Unfortunately, the consequence of water is not. So if you over-irrigate, you don't realize as a farmer, but you are damaging the crop. But water is free. Fertilizer, in fact, I'll give you something very, very interesting to think about. The budget of Indian Ministry of Agriculture is $20 billion, annual budget. The fertilizer subsidy in India is $22 billion. So the subsidy is bigger than the entire ministry's budget. Now, this is one instance. I can count numerous. But my own realization is that anything that helps farmers get through these day-to-day uncertainties and their understood challenges. What I mean by understood challenges is that if you go to them with solutions that are going to be useful 5 years down the line, it might be very, very hard to scale them. It's a very tricky situation, but whatever can be proven today or 6 months down the line has a customer base, a significant customer base. And that is something that I think is worth thinking about during that conference. So if policy aligns with precision, capital aligns with efficiency, I think adaptation will scale automatically.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I'm sure that's raised loads of questions that we're going to come back to you with, but I'd like to turn to Usha next.
Great. May I?
Please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Paddy, thank you so much for the invitation and to be here today with you. I'm Usha Barwale-Zair, and I am with Grow Indigo Private Limited. Grow Indigo is a young company. We are, actually, if we can go back to the earlier slides. But if not, it's okay. Grow Indigo is a young company focused on sustainability in agriculture. Our primary footprint is in India today, and we also have small operations in Southeast Asia and Africa. And when I have some pictures for you to just show you what, hope to take you to the smallholder farmer that we service. Smallholder farmers, of course, make the majority of farms in India. And the two offerings that we have for the smallholder farmers revolve around biological inputs, which creates better soil health, improves productivity for the farmer, and carbon solutions. When I talk about biological inputs, we have the full range of biological products which we offer, starting from planting of the material to when the... It's okay, we don't have to do the presentation. It's just distracting. So when the biological business is a more traditional business, but the need for biological is greater than ever from the standpoint of how do we address soil health, and having scientific innovation-based products for the smallholder farmers is very, very important. We are unique in the sense that we offer biological solutions and create synergies between the carbon business and carbon solutions that we offer. So when you think about carbon, typically you will think about changing the practices. But here what we are talking about is incorporating biologicals also in the carbon program, which reduces either methane emissions or nitrous oxide emissions. So this synergy is really significant for the company, and we feel that it offers a more holistic solution for the farmer. I know that we have a diverse audience here today, so I just thought I'll share a little bit about Indian agriculture and why it is not only important for India, but it makes commercial sense, and for a small company like us where we are. So India is a large agrarian society, almost 400 million acres of farmland. And so when you talk about 400 million acres of farmland, that is a significant area that can be commercially serviced. Now, agriculture also is a greenhouse gas emitter, and thus needs to be paid serious attention to in terms of how do we reduce the carbon footprint from agriculture. But having said that, agriculture is also a solution which is immediate, can be scaled, and is probably the lowest cost in terms of mitigation. So when I say why is it scalable, you have the 400 million acres that are at disposal. Of course, even if you take 20 million acres of that in the first 5 years, 7 years, you can have a significant impact. The second is that cost of changing a farmer practice is significant, but not as high as deploying other carbon capture technologies and so on and so forth. So from that standpoint, I am of the view that it is probably the lowest cost solution that is available from a mitigation standpoint. So I talked about the 4 offerings that we have in Grow Indigo, one around biological inputs, and we work across the country. We have been able to reach more than 9 million farmers with our biological treatments. These are farmers who purchase the biological treatment. So only time we give away the treatment is when we do the initial trialing to show the performance of the trial, but after that, the farmer actually purchases the product. And 9 million farmers is a fairly good indication that the farmers really like the product and that they see value from it. I'll come back to what kind of value that generates. In the carbon solutions that we offer, we have 3 different offerings. One around regen ag, which is changing farmer practices, going from, let's say, transplanted rice to direct seeded rice where there's no standing water. And as a result, you have methane emission reduction, which can be quantified and converted into a carbon credit. Similarly, you can have tillage practice changes, the biological treatments which come in, and so on and so forth. So in the Regen Ag, we have 6 programs which are registered with different registries. Vera is one, Gold Standard is another one. And in this program, we have roughly just about 1.5 million hectares which are enrolled in the carbon program. Each hectare would generate roughly 2.5 tons of CO2 equivalent, so 2.5 credits. And our agreement with the farmer is very transparent in the sense that revenue from the carbon credit flows back to the farmer in the ratio of 60 to 75%, depending on the geography in the country. The second offering in the carbon solutions we have is around Scope 3. Scope 3 is where we are able to offer low carbon commodities to food companies, FMCG companies, and we have been able to do this successfully for the last 3 years. And the farmer receives a premium for this low carbon commodity. We are able to back it up with data, which provides traceability, full accountability of what practices and so on and so forth that the farmer has been able to use. So this is the farmer. Actually, as it turns out, the farmer's expectation for what premium they'll receive is very unclear. And so when the farmers received the checks, first and foremost, they were surprised that they got some money, which was above and beyond the commodity prices that they would get. This money, of course, comes a little bit later than the commodity when they take the produce into the miller or to the ginner. But to have that, and then I think that becomes a pull from the market for more farmers to adopt the technology. The last offering that we have in the carbon solutions is around biochar. This is something that uses crop residues to convert it into a value-added, durable source of carbon, which can be applied, and this becomes from a permanent standpoint, 100 to 200 year window for this carbon to be present and improves soil health, of course, overall from a carbon perspective, but then also better water management and nutrient utilization. So when we look at these technologies, the farmer is benefiting anywhere between 30 to 35% additional income if they deploy all of these tools which are at their disposal. So this is a significant commercial gain for the farmer. It could be as high as equivalent to 2 months of additional salary that they would get at a household level. I already mentioned that we have achieved some level of scale, commercial scale, and of course, we are well on our way to achieving 10 million hectares with our carbon program. And the biological business, of course, is at the moment, while we have 9 million farmers who use the products, but it's still a drop in the ocean compared to the overall input side of the agriculture business. The biocarbon synergy is something that we see as a long-term sustainable solution for the farmer. And so it's not just that you'll get money from the carbon credit, but you're actually improving the soil health and improving the productivity on the farm. All of this and the scale is actually not possible if you don't have technology. And so technology is something that we have been able to develop over the last 4 years of the carbon program. where all of the farmer data is digitized, all of the interventions that we promote with them go to them as a message at a regular frequency. We are able to monitor the practices that they've adopted. We can identify if it's the right crop that they've claimed based on remote sensing data, and so on and so forth. So this is really a strength, I would say, that we have been able to develop this program. Lastly, I would say that the carbon program, while it's super exciting, it's also a front-loaded cost business. And there are no revenue streams for, if everything works well, no revenue streams for 2 to 3 years. But something doesn't work well, then maybe no revenue stream for 4 to 5 years. And so this is one thing which is really concerning for companies like us, which are young companies. We've been fortunate to have support, including from BII, but this is still a concern that remains, because carbon in commercial agriculture is so new. So you leave aside forestry. Beyond that, these activities are so new that financing becomes a real driver for how much scale and at what speed we are able to achieve that. And I would say, lastly, once the farmer receives payment in hand, that is when the farmer and the neighbors start to adopt all the technologies that we are promoting and we are bringing to the farmer. And as Shailendra already mentioned, the smallholder farmer is risk averse to a certain extent, but very, very curious and wanting to adopt if they see value at the end. So they may not be economists, but they understand the bottom line as to what is left at the end of the day in their pocket from the use of technology. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, so many questions I would like to ask about that, and I'm sure the audience feels the same way, but hopefully now we have Alec joining us online. Alec, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Paddy. Maybe just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it, okay?
Yep.
Yep, you're good. Okay, hi. Very sorry not to be able to join you guys in London today. Sadly, some family things have got in the way of that. So I'm Alec Martin, Managing Director at AgDevco. I look after climate change, ESG and impact, and work with our commercial agriculture team closely on that. So who's AgDevco? Well, maybe some kind of top line figures to help understand a bit about what we do. In 2024, our portfolio of investment companies supported 2.7 million smallholders and downstream traders in African ag, about 30,000 jobs, and we produced about 1.2 billion affordable protein portions within the portfolio. So that's the kind of footprint of what we do. We're an Africa-focused agriculture impact investor. So we only do Africa and we only do ag. Been working for about 15 years in this space, and we're about 350 million assets under management, something like that, across about 10 countries and 35 investments. So we're quite specialist, but then quite diversified as well at the same time. We have funding from long-standing funding from British government, who've been instrumental in us building and developing and scaling. And more recently, very pleased to have BII, Norfund, Swedfund as shareholders, and also funding from DFC. So we're in that kind of DFI aligned impact investment space. We've recently raised a new ventures fund, which is focusing on slightly smaller scale investment as well. So that's a little bit of background to who we are and what we do. And maybe a few remarks just on our kind of climate journey. I think, Paddy, you said you'll maybe come back with some specific kind of maybe technical questions for some of us, depending on time. But maybe a little bit about our priorities on climate and what we're doing. And they fall across both the kind of emission side of things and adaptation and resilience. So when COP26 came along and everyone was making their net zero statements, we were also aligned with that process. We think it's very important that agriculture is on a journey towards carbon efficiency and Paris alignment. That said, we're also very conscious that African agriculture is actually a very, very small source of emissions in the grand scheme of things. And maybe what the biggest and most important impact of our investment and work with our portfolio is on the adaptation and resilience side of things. And that's an ongoing piece of work for us. So we work across both areas. In recent years, what have we seen? We've seen, maybe at the time that we were making our initial climate commitments, that people were talking about this stuff being important, but there wasn't so much acknowledgement of what was happening on the ground. Now all the farmers in our portfolio are telling us regularly about the realities of climate change, the impacts they're having on their production, and that's playing out in very many different ways. Similar comments to what have been said earlier, but increased amplitude of events, increased unpredictability of events, very significant in Africa for us, is interfaced with other climatic phenomena like El Nino and La Nina cycles. We've seen that very much in the last couple of years. So we're seeing all these things actually happening on the ground, and they're having material impacts on commercial performance, on ability for the farmers to produce what they need to. But what we're also seeing is there's a real lack of continuity in information about this stuff. There's a real lack of harmonization of the way that this is reported, so we can't build up big picture trends and analysis, which is really important. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in things. There's a lot of kind of micro effects. And so climate forecasting things have real limitations at farm level. So what are AgDevCo doing to kind of support this? Well, adaptation and resilience is kind of baked into farming. Farmers are very adaptive, smart folk who find solutions to doing things. So they've always been thinking about issues like water stress. They've always been thinking about things like efficiency, because you don't want to spend more money on inputs than you need to. So to some extent, it's part of the culture, and it's not been necessarily a hard pivot to say we're now going to become adaptive and resilient, but it's more that the importance of those things are more significant. And so what are we doing as an investor to support that? Well, we're trying to help with technical support. We're quite unique as an investor to have quite in-house expertise in agronomy and climate change and that sort of thing, and we provide technical support to investees. We have a TA program, which is funded by our DFI partners, where we're doing things like regenerative ag and IPM, so that's integrated pest management trials. And this risk-taking thing is really important, actually. These trials are really expensive to do. They're data hungry to get good output from them, and therefore our ability to actually support farms in providing the resource to not only do the testing, but to measure that and get good data out of it is a really critical and important value add. We're also working closely with them to improve things like forecasting. What sort of climate events are likely to come? How is the forecasting coming through the different platforms actually relating to what they're seeing on the ground, and helping navigate that so that we can work with them to work out the best ways to understand what's going to happen going forward. And that's really critical to building that resilience on the ground. So maybe just to kind of wrap up on the AgDevCo introduction, I'll give you a case study that literally came through yesterday. This is a preprint in a discussion about an impact study that we're just about to publish. One of our investees, which is responsible for about a third of the jobs within our portfolio, is a financial intermediary doing microfinance for plant and equipment leasing in East Africa. And one of the things that's just come out of the impact study from them was that the provision of this finance is enabling the farmers to have the equipment they need on the ground at the time they need. And traditionally, they might have said, well, I need a farm, I need a tractor or a plow or whatever, and say May. But actually, as someone said earlier in the call, that may now be in February or that may now be in June. And being able to finance that equipment being present means that these people can be very responsive to that planting window when it comes, maximize the benefit of the rains, and then really boost their adaptation and resilience to these changing systems. So that's direct evidence that's just come back from the ground from an impact study that we've just done that shows maybe how this investment ecosystem that we're working in is helping that adaptation and resilience on the ground. I'll stop there, Paddy, and maybe we'll come back to specific questions in due course.
Thank you very much. I am going to turn to the audience soon, but I can't resist just asking a few more questions myself. So, Jessica, I wanted to ask, where is your... One thing I want to ask about, you're working with an NGO, but where is the commercial seed industry in the world that you observe? And is there an equal interest in experimentation you're seeing just through the, commercial seed providers? And then also, could you help us give a sense of where you think, what the most exciting gains on offer are? I mean, I don't know at all whether it comes from sort of needing less pesticide or whether it comes from drought resilience. Is there a clear sort of hierarchy of what the most exciting potential improvements to be had are when it comes to improved seed varieties?
So I actually think those are kind of related, because I think what happens is that you have the reason that the organization that I work with is an NGO is because they recognize that they need to subsidize the price as it enters the market. So from the perspective of what a farmer would see, or even what an input seller would see, they don't really know that they're working with an NGO because they just tell them a price and then they sell it through the market. But what's interesting is that they've recognized that it's really about the innovation pipeline. So they recognize they need to continually develop and distribute new seeds, and that development is not necessarily priced in at the price that the farmer is going to see. And so that's part of the answer to the question, because I think there are some types of seeds in some markets where there's a commercial case for it, where you can develop the seeds and there's an innovation pipeline that's sustainable based on market prices that farmers will adopt. So sort of maize, for example, is a large market. Lots of farmers grow maize. And even in the United States, we have private markets that are developing seeds. But at the same time, there's tons of other types of crops that are grown that may not have as large of market, may not have as large of potential for scale at commercial prices, where you do have the kind of necessity to subsidize throughout the innovation pipeline, which is also very similar to what we see in the United States. I work at a land grant institution, which means that a lot of the faculty are dedicated to agricultural production or resource management in the local state. And so we see the same thing. There's a lot of, where I'm from, the big markets are timber and wine, which are just two extremes of the type of commodity production, right? And so you see some faculty who work on, developing the right type of grape varieties that are appropriate for farmers to adopt versus, commercial incentives for forest management, as an example.
And we heard from Josh this extraordinary situation in which Kenyan dairy farmers really do need water storage, and yet their own saving and loan cooperatives wouldn't lend money for them to get one until this innovation of using the asset itself as collateral. And so Shailandra and Usher, I guess when I was listening to you, I was thinking, are you also trying to sell something with a high upfront cost, and is one of the barriers to the expansion of your business, the credit constraints that your farmers have? Or do you even sort of take it upon yourself to spread out the cost of what you sell, so that you're kind of financing what the farmers are buying from you yourself in a sense? Is that in India, is that a problem for you, these severe credit constraints that farmers face?
That's a great question. Can I go back to my slide, please? I think it will help. So it is very important that you understand who we are talking about. As a farmer, so India, as Usha said, has roughly 400 million acres of farmland. It creates for a very pyramidal structure on how farmers behave. My own understanding is that farmers primarily behave basis what crop they grow. So a farmer who is growing paddy is going to behave in a very different way, because the cost of cultivation per acre would be, let's say, perhaps $300, $400. The revenue could be around $700, $800. Vis-a-vis a farmer growing 1 acre of maybe pomegranate would be spending around $3,000, $4,000, would be making per acre around $10,000, $15,000. So when we started Paddy, the technology was very expensive. Let me use this. What you see on this screen, the devices that you see, they are an array of sensors. They collect a lot of data from the ground, from the climate, around the trees and whatnot, and they were expensive. And we also realized that to benchmark it in farmers' minds, we could look at another technology that had scaled up within this segment. That was drip irrigation. So India has roughly around 25 million hectares under drip irrigation. There is a very large government program subsidizing it. And so we benchmarked the cost of drip irrigation per acre vis-a-vis what was our cost. It was very easy to prove to farmers then that they should pay for it. Of course, we continued doing the engineering further and further, and we now manufacture these at less than, the bigger machine that you see on extreme left is manufactured at around $250. The smaller one that you see on the right side is manufactured at around $100. Of course, the cost of service and all make it a little bit more expensive. But I think the most critical slide for this answer is this. I think what gets missed is when you look at agriculture from a very homogeneous perspective, you miss out opportunities. What that means is, sitting in 2018, it would have sounded an oxymoron to anybody who has not seen agriculture in the way that it is layered, to say that we would be able to sell these kind of, we have deployed almost 15,000 of them now. We are also the largest network of these kind of devices within India. And hopefully, at the rate we are scaling, we'll probably reach around 100,000 in the next 3 to 4 years. But if you look at this number, which is average revenue of these kind of farmers, you suddenly realize that it is not very expensive. It proves its ROI within a season or maybe a couple of seasons. Even if they precisely irrigate, they recover the cost, because if you irrigate precisely, you are reducing the disease pressure, the pest pressure, the requirement of nutrition, the requirement of water. Roots are healthier, they produce better outcome. So to answer your question, we took a hard call saying we are not going to take subsidies, because subsidies create sort of a dependence for scale unless they are really proven. And in 2018, this was not a proven concept. We researched for around 3 years before we actually launched it. Now it is proven, now subsidy can play a role, but then not. Whether we had to justify the cost in terms of ROI, yes. To farmers, they were able to understand what they get out of it in a season, whether the cost recovers or not. There are numerous examples of farmers who had 5 acres or 10 acres, were probably growing half of it because they realized they needed more water, but they did not. There were plethora of farmers who sprayed a lot, were trying to pursue exports, could never figure out why they were not able to export, because every time they would breach the MRL limit, they were able to export. So a lot of variations on how farmers have received ROI.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to ask Usha, I'm not sure whether what you sell has a large upfront cost, but you did mention that sometimes there's like a 5-year period until revenues materialize. So is there also like a sort of inherent financing problem somewhere, either on the farmer side or on your side, to kind of bridge that time period?
So we don't have a large upfront cost, in terms of the farmer needing to make a large investment. It's the company which needs to develop the technology, work on various data collection, field activities, which is the cost that I was talking about in terms of front-loaded cost. There could be instances where if a practice change requires new equipment, then we would need to look at whether the farmer would buy it or a cooperative would buy it, or would the government provide some of the resources for such technology. So India is a mixed bag, I would say, in terms of access to credit for the farmers. So if the farmer owns land, it's probably easier. If the farmer is a well-to-do farmer, the farmer has access. But the more marginal farmers, I think, find it very, very challenging to get access to credit. And this access for these marginal farmers comes at a very high cost. So 3% on a monthly basis interest rates, which are getting charged by the money lender in the village. And this then puts them in that cycle where they can never get out of repaying that money. So yes, it's a mixed bag.
And Tomoko, your organization is a non-profit, but then you're also doing something which has a kind of it does have a revenue model. People are willing to pay for the services that you are offering in your.
Actually, so the services that we offer through governments, if it's digital agriculture advisory services, right now most of that is free for farmers. I think there are different revenue models where maybe the value chain players, the incentive alignment there, where they would benefit from farmers increasing yields and using certain types of practices, or there might be a kind of a revenue model through the private sector kind of paying and contributing to providing services. But I would say, I think maybe the difference, kind of different payment models might work, if you're targeting larger farmers and with the more complex information, add-on services, there might be kind of freemium model that, a lot of kind of entities, like I think there's a lot of interest now about kind of creating those bundled service model where maybe there's a free layer of foundational information services with climate information, weather forecasting, things like that, but private players can plug in to provide add-on services. So I think one challenge is, especially if we're trying to reach, scale, and serve, the kind of the poorer segment of farmers. Information is a public good, so it might be difficult to try to monetize a certain class of information, again, like climate advisory and so forth. But there are ways that these kind of both governments and private sectors are exploring. I don't think there's a success model yet to come up with this like bundled services with more value add.
Okay. And staying on the theme of finance, Alec, I want to try and get this question right, because I know that there are agricultural businesses which can be they're successful commercial businesses, and you can invest in them as a commercial investor. At the same time, I know from previous conversations with AgDevCo, there might be sort of, I guess what the right word is, layers or areas of the agricultural world where the risk-return profile that you're being offered in a kind of pioneering African agricultural business might not fit the expectations of people that are used to kind of looking at what they get from a private equity fund elsewhere, let's say. So what's your way of describing where concessional money is needed and where it's not needed, and like what the importance of that in what you do?
We are now profitable, which has taken us a while to get to, but you're right. It's very challenging for business. Usha talked about it before. There's a long lead into profitability in some of these activities, particularly in things like plantation businesses, where you first put the trees in and it will take maybe 3 to 4 years before you get any revenue, for example. So there are quite different types of financial model for the different types of business that we work with, and therefore the kind of solution and the patience of the capital, the structuring needs to vary. And we try to do that in different ways, for example, through mezzanine debt that allows the basic coupon to be lower, and then there's an upside later on if there's a successful outcome to the deal. So there are solutions like that, which can take place. They need to be quite tailored to the specific model. I think where we're really interested in maybe concessional funding and support from the LPs, DFIs, etc., is in the space where people have to take additional risk or try new things which are unproven. And there's definitely space there, I think, for additional funding. So maybe just kind of 3 brief things there. I think one, we need to build the knowledge base more. I think the DFIs and the LP community could do a hell of a lot of benefit by harmonizing what they're asking for, even if that's just in terms of the register of all the acute climate events that have happened, using consistent vocabulary, vernacular descriptions, so we can really understand what's happening at scale. That would be hugely valuable to then informing decision making, and that's something that you guys could all push at a very low cost, but provide us all with the knowledge, and we've talked about knowledge from other speakers before, to make better decisions. So there's one thing there. The second thing is maybe actually more cash focused, putting a bit more money behind actually doing new different things in terms of adaptation, taking that risk to move to a more regenerative thing, taking that risk to try a new technique, which isn't part of the core operating model, but may in 10, 15 years be very beneficial to that business, but in the short term is not. We do a bit of that through our TA fund, but we're quite limited in terms of kind of actual capital allocation. We can provide advice, but we can't do much in terms of actually putting hard cash up or offering blended finance, so reduced expectations on payback. And at the same time, the fund managers like us, in order to operate well in this space, we need expertise. So we tend to have a heavier cost model as an organization relative to a PE fund, which would be quite lean. So maybe there's also an acknowledgement that the returns are maybe lower and that the management costs of an organization like us may need to be a bit higher if we're going to build that impact relative to a lean PE fund. And then I think the last thing maybe is on emission reduction, because we've been talking about adaptation and resilience a bit. In terms of emission reduction, if there's no market demand for it and there's no transitional risk in terms of kind of carbon taxing, for example, and if emissions are relatively low, there is really not a great driver for a business to push emission reduction. So I think if we want that for those types of businesses, and there are many in our portfolio, for example, we actually have to find a way to pay for that. There's a much clearer case where there is a need for power security and there's a sensible cost basis to move to solar, for example. But in other cases, there's just no real market or business motivator to move to lower emissions. And therefore, we do need to find ways to actually fund that if we want that to happen more quickly. So I'll leave that there, Paddy.
Great, thanks. And Josh, so you've talked to us about water storage, but I know from speaking to you last night that there are other things that can be bought, and biodigesters is one of them. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing there.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, I mean, to the big question beyond what I already mentioned on kind of figuring out how to get more SACCOs serving dairy farmers to scale access to loans for water tanks is how do we build on this in a much more general sense? Clearly, this must work beyond water tanks. Clearly, this must work beyond dairy. My guess is that for other types of farmers with regular income, that you could structure something similarly in a value chain finance way. And there are other types of assets that also probably function well in this sort of asset collateralized manner that have sufficiently low depreciation, sufficiently low movability that they can, they can serve as effective collateral for the period of the loan. And so biodigesters is one where there's been a lot of interest from some of our partners in Kenya. They're starting to try these out. Seems to be some demand for them. It's early days, and so I don't want to overstate it, but I think there's interest among a couple different partners to think about asset collateralization for biodigesters, for chaff cutters for the production of feed. But I think another kind of interesting angle is that these water tanks are very good collateral and they depreciate very slowly. Some of them have a 30-year lifespan. And so in addition to effectively serving as collateral for the purchase of the water tank, then you have a stock of farmers with a collateralizable asset that can use it to make other investments that would otherwise be out of reach. And so when we think about improving kind of smallholder productivity and moving into a more intensive production system for dairy, there's other investments that they could make that now are enabled by having access to this, not only the water storage, but the asset that they can pledge. And this is important for adaptation and resilience and welfare. It's also important for mitigation. I think that the FAO has a stat that dairy production in sub-Saharan Africa is at least 3 to 4 times as emissions intensive per liter as it is in Europe or the United States. And so there's big prospects for increasing the productivity of each dairy cow, not only improving the emissions intensity, but we also have some work showing that under some plausible assumptions about demand elasticity, that you could actually end up with an absolute reduction in herd size and an absolute mitigation benefit. So I think coming back to this kind of mitigation point.
Thank you very much. Now, I printed out myself some notes, but I failed to put the timing of the sessions on the notes. So Mamuna, where are we on time? We have 20 minutes, great. So let's turn to the audience. Do we have microphones coming around? Okay, well, we have Stephanie at the front, Nick there, and maybe as you're coming to it, let's start here, and then we'll go sweep this way.
Thanks very much. I'm Shaila Janamraju. I'm the Senior Managing Director of Impact Creative Global Innovation Fund. So a lot of what I've heard today is really fascinating, almost the juxtaposition of taking it from a research perspective and listening to what happens in practice. And in a small way, that kind of happens at Global Innovation Fund as well. We've probably funded quite a large range of RCTs to support scale decisions within our portfolios. And I just wanted to reflect on two things. One, which is that what we find, and I think this speaks to the point that our colleague from Development Innovation Lab was asking, which is that we find that about a third of our RCTs lead to decisions that are scale related. And that usually means that we're seeing at least a significant reason for us to continue to invest, and we've done scale kind of additional funding on that basis. About 4 or 5 of them, if you take, let's say about 27, 28 RCTs we would have done, about 5 of them have led to changes and pivots to the actual kind of model, and we've made changes, and we might even continue to fund. But about 11 or 12 of them we've walked away from, and for lots of reasons. One, which is that the scale, so the RCTs, once you scale, don't hold. There's no fidelity. Therefore, you're not getting the same level of impact. That is a bit of a problem. Sometimes we walk away for other reasons, and sometimes it's because other partners are willing to fund it. But my point is that actually we're finding increasingly that perhaps it's not the only type of evidence that you need to think about. And especially for adaptation and resilience investments, I find it really difficult because the context really matters. So how do you do scale? So the second bit of work that we've been trying to think about is what are the scale barriers? So we're kind of pivoting as an organization away from basically looking at how is it that we can look at what are the scale barriers for adaptation and resilience solutions. And we only find that evidence and sort of research and stuff is in maybe one of the 6 factors. The other factors that we're seeing increasingly a lot of is around unit costs, really getting on top of that, business models, B2G, B2G2C. There are certain things that are easier to do for adaptation resilience kind of solutions and others are. And then the big one that we're finding more and more is regulatory barriers across countries. And we see it on bioherbicide, we see it for things to do with, we're doing some work around carbon finance and in sort of cattle raising. And that is a barrier that's at an ecosystems level that I think other people need to look at. We've got one that is a striga weed that there's a bioherbicide for, there's a striga belt across. Honestly, the scale issue isn't that the product isn't there, that the price points aren't there. It's really that we gotta actually get into and East Africa and then move onwards. And that happens to a lot. So we can see scale solutions happening, but the barriers are looking different for scale.
Thank you very much. And it sounds like getting cash into farmers' hands quite quickly is part of the, like what causes things to scale. I want to come back and talk about the regulatory environment, but could we maybe collect 2 more questions before we come back to the panel? So there was Nick there and Steffi here, please.
So my question is for Shailendra. So you mentioned and described very deliberately the business case for going to the highest value kind of horticulture segments. A lot of the social sort of costs of agriculture are in other segments, like you mentioned paddy rice or fertilizer, which is widely used outside. Of course, as a business, you can't control the government policy, but a lot of the reason why that kind of broader segment is not profitable to enter is because of policies like subsidies for free pumping for agriculture, fertilizer subsidies, and so forth. I wonder if I could ask you to speculate, how would your market change? How would your business scale change if those policies were amended? That is, if farmers had to pay the cost of pumping, how would the interest, the demand for your products change? Do you ever, feel your mouth water at the opportunity in this kind of scale? And how do you think it would change, the demand for, as you say, efficiency as opposed to overuse?
Right, and we get a mic to Steffi here, please.
Hi, thank you very much. This was super interesting. I've got two questions. I think one might be for Jessica, but obviously if anyone else can answer it. So I'm just interested because I think the planning for change is so important. And I was just contemplating about what time frame do you plan for when you distribute seeds? Because I guess climate change is so unpredictable and we don't know how 2050 looks like versus now. And then I had this kind of question in my head about if adaptation or change for these people is so difficult, how do you then account for this ever needing change? And therefore, should you be planning for a time in the horizon for seeds that are, suitable for 2040, for example, versus seeds that maybe are more immediately needed? So that was my first question. And then my second question, I think it's for Tomoko, and it's something that I ponder about a lot is around this. When you're distributing digital early warning systems are fantastic. They're fantastic for a population that has power, and they're fantastic for a population which is literate. Often I work in sub-Saharan Africa mainly, where obviously illiteracy is very, very high, and many of the places in rural areas where subsistence farmers live, where climate impact are the biggest felt. What might be other strategies for these, or do you somehow consider that in sort of these early warning systems? Can that be accounted for? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know where that mic's going or how. So, Usha, maybe you could start with are you operating under a friendly regulatory environment when it comes to bio inputs, or do you actually, is that one of the big problems you have, like the regulation?
The biological space is, so there are two different regulations which apply in India. One for what is classified as biofertilizer, which comes under the fertilizer control order. And then there is, for biopesticides, it comes under the Central Insecticide Board. So it's a two-pronged approach. There have been some challenges on one category of product approval in the last 4 years. Only recently there has been amendment to that regulation, which gives us some optimism that some of our new products we would be able to register. But the biofertilizer part of it has been fairly smooth. So we are able to go forward, and then recently, a knee-jerk reaction type of situation from the Agriculture Ministry saying stop order for sale of 3,000 products which were on the market. And overnight, you can't sell it because somebody sold a spurious product, and that led to this whole sort of reaction. So regulations are there. You have to plan for it. So when you are doing a product development, you really need to work on making sure that you generate all the regulatory data and submit it for the approvals. Now, of course, if they're not accepting the application, that's a problem, but I don't see that as a long-term problem.
Thank you.
Can I jump in on this sort of innovation scaling point as well? And this comes back to part of the discussion on where public money comes in alongside private. So the Global Innovation Fund has, I think, operated under a model. There's a couple of other entities, the Fund for Innovation and Development that from in France, and USAID's Development Innovation Ventures, before it recently closed, have operated under this tiered model of funding based on evidence. And so this is sort of adopting a portfolio approach, kind of modeled after almost a venture capital approach to providing tiered funding, but thinking about social returns rather than just purely private returns, so accounting for other things. And so they start with small amounts of funding to pilot interventions, perhaps do a small scale randomized trial. For some that pass that stage, they can get kind of stage 2 funding, which allows a much larger study or positioning a model for scale, and then can move on to stage 3 or even greater amounts of money. And this has been a very effective model, and this is something through the Innovation Commission we've thought also about some of these sort of meta innovations that can support the process of identifying and scaling innovations. And some research by our faculty director, Michael Creamer, and some of his co-authors shows that if you take a portfolio if you take a portfolio view of the early investments that USAID DIV made, so they invested in, I think, 41 innovations. 9 of them scaled up to reach more than 1 million people. For 5 of those, they can quantify in dollar terms the benefit from a rigorous randomized trial of each person reached. And if you account just for the benefit of those 5 innovations against the cost of the whole portfolio, there's a 17-to-1 benefit cost ratio, social benefit cost ratio. In some cases, there are private benefits. In some cases, really, this is like a diffuse social benefit. And if you look at the even longer term returns, I think they're updating that analysis, and it looks, it continues to look extremely favorable. So I think that adopting some of these sort of private sector approaches to thinking about a portfolio of public support rather than, oh, we invested in this one thing and it didn't scale up, therefore this investment was a failure. Sometimes that can be the case. Sometimes there aren't sufficient controls on how public investment gets made in a particular case. But I think if you have a portfolio that thinks about kind of tiered funding in this way, you can manage that and you can think about the social returns of the portfolio, and that can look very good.
And then maybe, Shailendra, the mouth-watering prospect of more expensive water.
I think this was a very interesting question. So when we started off, we started working with horticulture farmers because they had money and the sensibility to understand their P&L. Now, while working with them, we went through third-party audits on what kind of impact do we generate. So the numbers between 2021 to 23 were like this. Between these farms, we saved 83 billion liters of water. If you want to envisage 83 billion liters, Hyde Park has a serpentine lake, multiply it into 211 times. Some 56,000 metric tons of GHG emission, and some 156,000 kilograms of pesticide reduction. But still, with all of these numbers, the farmers had enough money to pay for the technology. Now, very recently, I was invited for a round table where the Indian government asked a question that using AI, what is that one intervention that we can do that would scale in 10 years, not 20, not 30, but would have national scale implications. So I studied about that question quite a lot. And this is in reference to the larger market. So Indian horticulture market is about 30-35 million hectares. Vis-a-vis, let's say, Indian paddy market is about 43 million hectares plus. So of course, that's a significantly large land holding, though the amount of GDP that you generate from that land is lesser. But one large intervention that I realized could have national implications was precision irrigation. Now, I was trying to do the mathematics. If you apply these same numbers on even entire Indian horticulture, the numbers were like this. Like, it would save between 12 to 18 trillion liters of water. That is enough water for England, UK, for 5 years for drinking. That's part one. It saved anywhere between 16 to 18 terawatt hours of electricity. That is enough electricity for like 10 Indian states. And I can go on. But while I was doing this mathematics, and of course the fertilizer number that I mentioned, about $20 to $23 billion in investment that practically goes in water. But when I realized that if you look at a paddy farmer, his cost of cultivation on his books is lesser. But in government's books, it is higher because they are subsidizing it. And so my hard realization was that suddenly my business has to shift if I can continue selling to horticulture farmers, and I must. But from the crops which are subsidized, the customer is not the farmer. The customer is government. And the government has more than enough money to pay. Like, even if you look at that $22 billion in subsidy, if they would probably divert 2.5% of it on technologies that can reduce fertilizers, they would go in significantly higher order of impact. So to answer your question, definitely is mouth-watering. And I think suddenly when you realize these numbers, you realize that the customer is somebody else. And the customer is paying a lot of money already. And for them, it could be chump change if they want to start scaling these kind of technologies on scale.
And Steffi's questions, it was Tomoko. And Jess, did you have a question outstanding as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, thinking about the innovation pipeline. And I think that's just one of these critical questions that keep coming up is like, how do you have this continual investment so that new seeds are coming online in a way that they're adapting to the climate change? So one thing that's really interesting to think about with seed selection is that a lot of it comes down to just the number of trials, right? So agronomists are running trials and they're getting results and then they're selecting seeds based on what they see. And so that's like even going back to the original green revolution crops with the development of dwarf wheat. All that was thousands of trials done in Mexico on a compressed time scale because they had enough resources to run it. And so now, cost of those things should be coming down. I think people are excited about the prospects of, CRISPR and other kinds of gene editing technology that will help speed up the process of seed selection. But even if you have maybe a CGIAR center, as in that case, that's making a discovery, you still have to do the local adaptation. And so that local adaptation is kind of naturally going to take into account how the climate is varying in a location. And so over time, you're going to kind of implicitly account for change. So there's not much you can do now to plan for 40 years, but as long as the innovation pipeline is robust enough, then you'll be planning for it all along. And so we do see one thing in the data and anecdotally is there's wide variation in farmers that are attached to seeds, the hybrid seeds that maybe came out in the 90s. This is a story we hear over and over again in Kenya. But at the same time, that's only a subset of farmers. Other Kenyan farmers who have a very similar profile are very capricious with their seed choices. They're kind of picking a different seed from the market all the time. And so there's market saturation, you're bringing on new seeds, they're promising climate resilience, and then it's just hard for a farmer to ascertain the differences. And so.
Paddy, can I just ask one very quick follow-up?
We've only got about 3 minutes left, and you did have the question to Tomoko. So can we get...
We'll chat afterwards. Sounds great. Yeah.
Just kind of adding to that point, actually. So with the seeds, I think the other challenge is also on the demand side. Farmers have to keep experimenting and learning about new seeds every few years, and I think that's another kind of challenging aspect of that. But to answer your question about kind of reaching remote areas and a certain populations that have low digital literacy, the other kind of piece of evidence around all these digital information services is that there is a pretty substantial spillover effect, especially with weather information. Just spreads really quickly within villages, and a lot of information, if you use mobile phones, you can really customize at the individual household level or farmer level. But governments and a lot of places, they're still they use radio, other modes of communication to disseminate weather forecasts, other kinds of actually agricultural advice. So there are a lot of different channels in the community. There are extension agents. So it's probably just a kind of a combination of all these channels and figuring out what types of information would be most efficient there. Just wanted to add one response to that, just generally the scaling question. As an implementer, kind of trying to take evidence from academic world and create something scalable, we have found that there is a fairly large gap in development finance because it takes a lot of additional iteration, experimentation to figure out what actually can scale, and there are post-regulatory environment and questions. So I think that's definitely there's more role for development finance. And I think when we are, you used to have this sense that, okay, if we find something that's effective, we'll find a way for it to get financed and adopted at scale. But I think our learning is that really doesn't happen. So at the stage of initially investing in ideas, we kind of have to figure out what's actually, the scalable model might look like, and then really calibrate our work along that.
And I really must apologize because I haven't left time to take questions online. So I'm going to make sure that maybe we'll do the online questions first in the next session. So sorry everybody who's watching online for my failure there. We are at time and everybody is probably desperate for a coffee. So let's applaud our great speakers. It's been terrific.